Look, just look at what is spilling out of the Cardi B empire tonight, because whispers in the room say Cardi B's own mother has now walked, on camera, into the middle of the biggest scandal week Cardi B has ever survived, and the footage is so brazen, so calculated, so surgically timed, that even the sharpest insiders in celebrity culture are asking one question out loud. Did Cardi B's mother just detonate her daughter's carefully guarded storyline on purpose? Alleged, alleged, alleged. But once you sit with the footage, once you look at what is mounted on that wall, once you connect it to the Chris Griffith interview burning across every timeline, once you factor in Brittany Renner's confession, once you weigh King Harris going nuclear on Plaqueboymax, you realize this is not a random news cycle. This is a fracture. And Cardi B is standing right at the epicenter of it. Here is the fracture. Cardi B's mother did not simply post a proud parent moment. She staged, framed, and broadcasted a full-blown museum wall of Cardi B's plaques, Cardi B's awards, Cardi B's trophies, and Cardi B's certifications. And she did it at the exact hour Cardi B was being pulled apart online for reasons that had nothing to do with music. The chatter behind the curtain says that this was not maternal pride. This was reputation warfare. This was a mother trying to remind the internet who her daughter is before the internet decided, on its own, who Cardi B was going to be by the end of the week. And the more you stare at that wall, the more it looks less like a celebration and more like a shield. Strip it down. Cardi B has spent the last 3 years being one of the most surveilled celebrities in the industry. Every relationship, every legal filing, every purchase, every custody decision, every hairline switch, every studio session, every emoji, every rumor about who Cardi B is with, who Cardi B is not with, who Cardi B is texting, who Cardi B is blocking, has become the daily currency of celebrity commentary. And when a mother of a woman that famous suddenly turns her own living room into a Cardi B monument, that is not accident. Follow the thread. Because at almost the same hour that footage of Cardi B's mother went viral, another storm cloud cracked open on the other side of the internet. That storm cloud is named Chris Griffith. And what Chris Griffith just said about Stefon Diggs on camera has already been screen recorded thousands of times before this story is even 24 hours old. Alleged, alleged, alleged. Chris Griffith sat down for one of the most talked about interviews of the week and was asked a question no man in his position ever wants to hear on camera. He was asked to define his sexuality. Live. On record. And the answer Chris Griffith gave did not do what most interview subjects would try to do. Chris Griffith did not shut it down. Chris Griffith did not walk out. Chris Griffith did not pretend the question was beneath him. Chris Griffith went in. Chris Griffith broke it down. Chris Griffith drew a line between the words heterosexual and straight, referenced a whole cultural conversation happening online about the difference between those two words, and then, in the same breath, admitted that when he traveled with Stefon Diggs, Chris Griffith was not paying for anything. Chris Griffith was shopping alongside the women. Chris Griffith was walking the same aisles as the girls. And Chris Griffith looked directly into the lens and said, in his own words, that he understood exactly how that would look to the outside world. This is where the record cracks. Because Chris Griffith did not stop there. Chris Griffith went further. Chris Griffith admitted, without hesitation, that he wrote the name of his eldest child in ink across his own fingernails, the way a school kid scribbles on their skin with a Sharpie, and Chris Griffith said, out loud, that he knew exactly how the internet would read that too. Chris Griffith knew. Chris Griffith saw the interpretation coming. And Chris Griffith stared straight at it, and said he did not care, because Chris Griffith pays his own bills, Chris Griffith lives his own life, and Chris Griffith does not owe the internet a translation of his behavior. Follow the thread. Because whether you believe Chris Griffith, whether you doubt Chris Griffith, whether you defend Chris Griffith, whether you attack Chris Griffith, the fact remains that Chris Griffith has now put on the record a version of the Stefon Diggs travel dynamic that nobody in either camp ever confirmed before this week. And that is the part that changes everything. Because before this interview, the Stefon Diggs and Chris Griffith conversation was 50% rumor, 50% screenshots, and 100% deniable. After this interview, the conversation has a paper trail. After this interview, the conversation has a video receipt. After this interview, the conversation has Chris Griffith himself, on camera, saying the words. And the internet, being the internet, has already begun pulling those words apart syllable by syllable timestamp by timestamp, expression by expression, hunting for what Chris Griffith meant versus what Chris Griffith actually said, hunting for the crack between denial and confession, hunting for the sentence Chris Griffith did not realize he was giving them. Look, this is not about Chris Griffith's identity. That is Chris Griffith's business. Chris Griffith said, on record, that Chris Griffith is a heterosexual man, and Chris Griffith has every right to be believed at his word. But the story sitting under the story is the shopping story. The story sitting under the story is the credit card story. The story sitting under the story is the wall of men standing quiet while the girls picked out bags and Chris Griffith walked among them. Because that is the sentence that lit up every group chat in the country tonight. That is the sentence that will follow Stefon Diggs into every press conference for the next 12 months. And that is the sentence that has already begun to bleed into the Cardi B conversation. Because if you have been paying attention to who Cardi B has been photographed with, who Cardi B has been rumored to be seeing, who Cardi B has been publicly linked to, you already know exactly why Stefon Diggs' name is on this list tonight. The story flips. Because right as Chris Griffith's interview was ripping across timelines, another woman with her own hurricane of history walked into her own confession booth. Her name is Brittany Renner. And Brittany Renner said something on camera this week that stopped even her hardest critics in their tracks. Brittany Renner said Brittany Renner has left Los Angeles. Brittany Renner said Brittany Renner is now living in Mississippi. Brittany Renner said Brittany Renner is trying to rebuild her financial life from the ground up. Brittany Renner said Brittany Renner is raising a child with double the responsibility and half the help. And Brittany Renner said, in that same breath, that people do not simply wake up one morning and stop loving each other. Alleged. Because for a woman who was, at one point, one of the most talked about names in celebrity culture, a woman who was branded a symbol of a certain kind of Hollywood lifestyle, a woman who was mythologized in group chats and podcasts and clip compilations, hearing Brittany Renner say that Brittany Renner is now downsizing, relocating, and starting over, hit a nerve nobody expected. Because the internet loves to build somebody up as a villain, and then the internet gets uncomfortable the second the villain becomes a mother, a woman, a human being with rent, bills, custody logistics, and a bank account that has to survive real life. And Brittany Renner, out of nowhere, has forced everyone to sit with that discomfort in real time. Here is the fracture. Because the timing of Brittany Renner's confession is not innocent. Brittany Renner did not stumble into this admission on a slow news cycle. Brittany Renner walked into it in the exact same week that Cardi B's mother was decorating a wall, in the exact same week that Chris Griffith was decoding his sexuality, in the exact same week that the entire internet was already primed to interrogate the private financial arrangements of every woman connected, even loosely, to the celebrity ecosystem. So when Brittany Renner spoke, Brittany Renner was not speaking into silence. Brittany Renner was speaking into a room that was already on fire. And every word Brittany Renner chose, every pause Brittany Renner took, every soft admission Brittany Renner made about how hard it is to rebuild, landed differently because of what was happening around it. Follow the thread. Because rebuilding, for a woman like Brittany Renner, is never a private act. Rebuilding is a public performance whether Brittany Renner wants it to be or not. Rebuilding means the same commentators who cheered Brittany Renner's fall are now watching Brittany Renner's return with an even sharper knife. Rebuilding means the same podcasts that made Brittany Renner a punchline are now waiting to see if Brittany Renner can survive Mississippi long enough to make it back to Los Angeles. Rebuilding means every ex, every rumor, every alleged benefactor, every man Brittany Renner was ever publicly connected to, is being pulled back into the timeline as receipts, as evidence, as gossip currency. And Brittany Renner, who used to weaponize that attention, now has to survive it. Strip it down. Because if this were a normal week, Brittany Renner's confession would be the entire news cycle by itself. It would sit at the top of every commentary channel. It would be the thumbnail on every viral post. It would be the headline on every celebrity blog. But this is not a normal week. This is the week Cardi B's mother turned her wall into a shrine. This is the week Chris Griffith drew a line under his own sexuality on camera. This is the week Brittany Renner admitted her Los Angeles life is over. And this is also the week King Harris decided to detonate the internet with the sharpest, most unfiltered take on modern masculinity anyone has heard in months. Look, Just look at what King Harris did. King Harris watched the Plaqueboymax moment. King Harris watched a young man break down in tears on a live stream because a woman told him, in front of thousands of viewers, that he needed to twerk, that he needed to be a diva, that he needed to perform a version of himself that his own manhood was quietly rejecting in real time. King Harris watched that. King Harris processed that. And King Harris walked to a camera and said, in the plainest language possible, that the world does not care about a man's feelings, that a man is expected to stand in his pain, that a man is expected to eat the discomfort and keep working, and that when the culture starts encouraging grown men to twerk and diva on a live stream, the culture is not saving those men. The culture is feeding them to a machine. Alleged, because King Harris did not soften his opinion. King Harris did not sand the edges. King Harris did not water it down for the algorithm. King Harris said that when King Harris hears the word diva, King Harris thinks of a female professional wrestler, not a young man crying on stream. King Harris said that grown men have every right to do whatever grown men want to do in the privacy of their own lives. But the moment that behavior is being broadcasted, marketed, and monetized to children, King Harris draws a line. King Harris draws it hard. And King Harris does not care who wants him to redraw it. Here is the fracture. Because King Harris did not attack Plaqueboymax. King Harris did not mock Plaqueboymax. King Harris did not pile on. What King Harris did was more dangerous. King Harris named the machinery around Plaqueboymax. King Harris pointed at the streamers, the co-hosts, the audiences, the platforms, the executives, and the algorithm itself. King Harris said, without saying it, that the young men of this generation are being pushed into performances of femininity as a form of content extraction. And once King Harris said it, the entire internet was forced to admit, whether they liked King Harris or not, that King Harris was standing on a piece of ground that had not been named out loud in years. The story flips. Because now King Harris's comments have collided with the Chris Griffith interview, and the Chris Griffith interview has collided with the Cardi B wall, and the Cardi B wall has collided with the Brittany Renner confession, and the Brittany Renner confession has collided with the Stefon Diggs shopping story, and every single one of these threads is being pulled into the same conversation at the same time. And that is not a coincidence. That is a cultural moment. That is the moment the internet stops treating each celebrity as a separate news item and starts treating the entire ecosystem as a single burning building. And Cardi B, unfortunately for Cardi B, is standing on the top floor. Follow the thread. Because Cardi B is not the villain of this story. Cardi B is the connector. Cardi B is the gravitational center around which every other name in this cycle is orbiting. Cardi B is the reason her mother built the wall. Cardi B is the reason the Chris Griffith interview is being cross-referenced with Cardi B's own private life. Cardi B is the reason Brittany Renner's rebuild is being compared to what Cardi B might have to do if the wrong story lands the wrong way. Cardi B is the reason King Harris's comments about performative masculinity are being applied to the men currently in Cardi B's orbit. Cardi B did not choose to be the center of this week. Cardi B was drafted into it by proximity, by fame, by history, and by the fact that Cardi B has never, in her entire career, been allowed to be a private woman. Strip it down. Because if Cardi B were anyone else, that wall of plaques would just be a wall. It would be a mother's living room. It would be a proud parent showing off her daughter's success. It would be the kind of video that gets 40 seconds of applause and disappears by lunch. But because Cardi B is Cardi B, that wall becomes a statement. That wall becomes a rebuttal. That wall becomes a message aimed directly at the commentators, the bloggers, the ex-boyfriends, the rumor mills, the podcast hosts, and the algorithm itself. That wall becomes, in the eyes of every insider watching, a mother saying, without saying it, that no matter what the internet writes about her daughter this week, her daughter has already earned more than any of them will ever touch. Here is the fracture. Because the awards conversation is uglier than it looks. The awards conversation is not just about music. The awards conversation is about legitimacy. The awards conversation is about who gets to decide which women are permitted to stand at the top of the culture. The awards conversation is about whether Cardi B, who came from a background that most award committees historically pretend does not exist, is allowed to keep the recognition Cardi B has already collected. And every commentator who has ever rolled their eyes at those trophies is being forced, this week, to see them mounted, framed, and lit against a living room wall by the one person nobody can talk over. Her mother. Alleged. 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 Because commentators are already saying that the wall was too much. Commentators are already saying that a wall like that is what a celebrity does when a celebrity is scared. Commentators are already saying that when a woman like Cardi B needs her mother to defend her legacy on camera, the legacy is under attack. And even inside her most loyal fan base, there are voices, quiet but growing, wondering whether the mother would have needed to do this if the daughter were not, at this exact moment, in the fight of her public life. That is the question sitting inside the wall. That is the question the wall is trying to answer. And that is the question the internet is now asking out loud. The story flips. Because as loud as the Cardi B story is, the Chris Griffith story is going to outlast it. Chris Griffith did something on camera that cannot be untapped. Chris Griffith stood in front of a lens, drew a distinction between two words most people never separate, and then handed the audience a scenario, a very specific scenario, a shopping trip with Stefon Diggs and a wall of silent men that will now be quoted, requoted, memed, and dissected for years. Chris Griffith is not going to be able to travel with Stefon Diggs again without that footage playing in someone's head. Stefon Diggs is not going to be able to walk into a store with a friend again without a camera phone raising in the aisle. And every man in professional sports who has ever taken a friend shopping is going to think twice, 3 times, 4 times about who is standing in the frame with him when the receipts print. Just look at how tightly all of this is threaded. Because the Chris Griffith interview does not exist in a vacuum. The Chris Griffith interview exists inside a decade of celebrity culture that has quietly redefined what closeness between two men looks like on camera. It exists inside a media ecosystem that has been trained to weaponize ambiguity. It exists inside an algorithm that rewards suggestion over confirmation. It exists inside an audience that has been conditioned to read a fingernail, a nickname, a gift, a shopping bag, a plane ride, a hotel room, a birthday post, and a caption as evidence of a life the subject may or may not actually be living. And Chris Griffith walked into that ecosystem, sat down, and gave it a receipt. Follow the thread. Because Brittany Renner is now standing on the other side of that same ecosystem. Brittany Renner spent years being written into a narrative Brittany Renner did not fully control. Brittany Renner was called every name commentary channels could think of. Brittany Renner was reduced, over and over, to a punchline in other people's careers. And now Brittany Renner is trying to walk out of that narrative on her own terms, with a suitcase, a child, and a plane ticket back to Mississippi, and the internet cannot decide whether to root for Brittany Renner or bury Brittany Renner deeper. Either way, Brittany Renner is telling everyone watching that the version of Los Angeles that used to swallow women like her whole is finally being spit out, and Brittany Renner would rather rebuild in a state most commentators would never move to than pretend a broken life is a functional one. Here is the fracture. Because if you line up every character in this week's news cycle, if you put Cardi B, Chris Griffith, Stefon Diggs, Brittany Renner, King Harris, Plaqueboymax, and everyone orbiting them into a single frame, you are not looking at a gossip week. You are looking at a generational reckoning. You are looking at the moment celebrity culture stopped hiding behind curated images and started, publicly, tearing at its own seams. You are looking at mothers defending daughters. You are looking at men defining themselves out loud. You are looking at women walking away from cities that were supposed to make them. You are looking at young streamers being asked to perform pieces of themselves they cannot afford to give away. And you are looking at commentators, on every side, realizing that the old scripts do not fit any of this anymore. Strip it down. Because Cardi B did not ask for this. Chris Griffith did not want this level of dissection. Stefon Diggs did not sign up to be a footnote in another man's confession. Brittany Renner did not plan on being a case study for how Los Angeles chews women up. King Harris did not intend to become the loudest voice on modern manhood this week. And Plaqueboymax certainly did not schedule a live stream expecting to become a symbol of a young man's silent breaking point. But none of them, this week, get to decide what their moments mean. The audience decides. The algorithm decides. The commentators decide. And once the algorithm decides, it does not undecide. Alleged. 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 Because the deepest fear inside every celebrity publicist tonight is not a single story. The deepest fear is the pattern. The deepest fear is that Cardi B's mother, Chris Griffith, Brittany Renner, and King Harris did not go viral separately. They went viral together, in the same 7 days, in the same feed, on the same phones, in front of the same audience. And once an audience starts consuming celebrity news as a pattern instead of a series of events, publicists lose control, managers lose control, labels lose control, and the culture starts making judgments that no press release can walk back. The story flips. Because the ending of this week is not going to be written by any of the celebrities in it. The ending is going to be written by the comment sections. The ending is going to be written by the clip compilations. The ending is going to be written by the reaction videos, the group chats, the podcast rants, the barbershop debates, and the timelines that never sleep. Cardi B will wake up tomorrow to a version of herself she did not authorize. Chris Griffith will wake up to a version of his interview he did not edit. Brittany Renner will wake up to a version of her rebuild she did not narrate. King Harris will wake up to a version of his rant he did not soften. And every one of them will have to decide, in real time, whether to fight the version of themselves the internet has now built or to walk quietly away from a fight they were never going to win. Just look at where we are. A mother built a wall of trophies to defend a daughter who never asked to be defended. A man drew a line under his sexuality on camera and put the shopping receipts on record. A woman confessed that Los Angeles broke her, and Mississippi is where she is trying to survive. A young man went nuclear on a culture that is teaching young boys to perform femininity for clicks. And every single one of these stories, alleged as they may be, is now living inside the same 7-day window, in the same feed, in front of the same audience. That is not a coincidence. That is not a slow week. That is a moment. And the only real question